Welcome to this installment of Context Clues, where we give you some excerpts from past episodes that will help make our upcoming series a little bit richer. I'm your host, Chelsey Weber-Smith, and this is American Hysteria. Now, during Context Clues, I usually tell you what the future holds in terms of next week's episode, but this time, I don't want to. I want to keep it a surprise so you don't Google it and ruin my whole presentation. But what I will say is that this is a very haunting, strange, and sort of beautiful topic about the future, the faraway future, the kind of future we can't even start to fathom. What will our world be like in 100 years, 1,000 years? What about 10,000 years? Of course, we often imagine this future to be apocalyptic, with most of the human race burned to a crisp from climate disasters and nuclear warfare, or killed off by a vicious pandemic, nature strangling the massive buildings of the old world, taking it all back. Or we imagine a reality of half cyborgs, humans in spacesuits, flying cars, a colonized Mars, a whole General Jetsons vibe. Or maybe we're all just lying in bathtubs full of goo, fed through tubes with a chip inserted in our brains, our reality determined by whatever we want it to be. We can predict these things, but we cannot know. This is the basis of our next series, what is called Deep Time, and how we, in the 21st century, think of our future distant relatives that we will never meet, and who will likely remember us as we remember cavemen, and study us as specimens that made some questionable choices. If they can talk to the past, if they can talk to us through archaeology and anthropology, is there a way that we can talk to them? We'll get started with Context Clues right after this. The specter of nuclear war, of the atomic bomb, of mutually assured destruction has haunted all of our lives, most of us from the very beginning. Since the mid-1940s, regular Americans have been dealing with the horrific reality of the atomic bombs our government dropped on Japan in 1945. Americans have also dealt with the knowledge that other nations, some hostile to the U.S., could at any time launch an atomic bomb back at us, killing perhaps hundreds of thousands of people like we once did. As is often the case, popular culture dealt with these repressed fears and this repressed guilt, which was at its most potent during the 50s and 60s. And as usual, it was the horror genre that took the lead at expressing these fears, most often the fears of nuclear fallout, of radiation's unknown effects on human beings. It wasn't yet understood what radiation could do to otherwise healthy individuals, and in fact, the government, weapons manufacturers, and nuclear power companies took steps to hide that information from the public for decades. So how did these horror movies deal with these unknowns? Let's find out in this section from our episode called Horror Movies, Part 1. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed between 129,000 and 226,000 Japanese men, women, and children, the vast majority of them civilians. The only time this would happen in world history. Through this atrocity, suddenly Americans saw the power and potential of the negative side of what science could do, and it was absolutely terrifying. By the 60s, polls were showing that trust in science declined from 50% to a third of citizens. As suburban Americans were doing their best to try to stop worrying and learn to love the bomb, science fiction horror began dominating the 1950s cinema and started to express an accompanying fear to this fear of an atomic holocaust. The fear of slowly seeping, unstudied nuclear fallout caused by radiation. As America and the Soviet Union were testing their hydrogen bombs, the Cold War was intensifying, and the tests were getting closer and closer to the actual land of Americans, and then into our own remote deserts of New Mexico. There were reports of fallout dust spreading into the air and water, and the nation was alarmed at the link to rising cancer rates. But far more intensely, they were alarmed about possible mutations in humans, yes, most of all, but also in bugs. Now, human beings have a natural fear of arthropods, as they can carry disease. And in 1954, this instinct combined with bugs being the hip new social panic of the time, and thus created a brand new important political issue. Insects were seen as a rising problem already, and the government and companies were using massive campaigns of scary pesticides in order to try to kill them off, especially DDT. But when the attempts at insect control failed spectacularly, the bugs began to seem almost invincible, as the chemicals harmed and killed many different animal species, but did nothing to stop the bugs. Newspapers, scientists, and even the government were suddenly sounding the alarm about these indestructible overthrowers. A Nobel Prize-winning geneticist named Hermann Joseph Muller, nicknamed Mr. Mutation, began warning Americans about the effects of radiation. The fruit flies he was testing his theories on were certainly developing issues, and when he published the results, the press called the specimens monsters, monstrosities, mutations. One newspaper wrote,
"Some have big eyes. Some have one large and one small eye. Some are blind, some are long-winged, others have no wings. Furthermore, when these monstrosities breed, their progeny are also monstrosities."
Thus, Muller concluded and told the public human babies exposed to radiation could be born with 2 heads. And not only that, the issues would continue down the genetic line into perpetuity. But bugs weren't just vulnerable to fallout. An official spokesperson of the Army Medical Laboratory said, quote,
"Should man destroy himself with awe-inspiring weapons and inventions, both man and animal could perish, leaving nothing but hardy insects to repopulate the world."
A Mississippi representative named Jamie Whitten would write in his Pro-Pesticides book,
"The enemy is already here, in the skies, in the fields and waterways. It is dug into every square foot of our earth. It has invaded homes, schoolhouses, public buildings. It has poisoned food and water. It brings sickness and death by germ warfare to countless millions of people every year. Some of them eat or attack everything man owns or produces, including man himself."
The media began sharing the most extreme of the descriptions and images from the official 1952 Department of Agriculture yearbook. Ants the size of wolves, enormous locusts whose legs could be used as saws, insects using gas warfare, moths with a wingspan of a foot, beetles so large they sounded like B-52s. Now, I'm not positive how much of that was actually in that official document, but at least some of it was. Just 2 years later, Warner Brothers' highest-grossing movie of 1954 would be a film called Them, focusing on the fallout of an atomic bomb tested in the New Mexican desert and the mutant ants that would grow large enough to grab a human being in their mandible. The ants' goal? To wipe out all human life on Earth, of course.
Yes, cities, nations, even civilization itself, threatened with annihilation, because in one moment of history-making violence, nature, mad, rampant, wrought its most awesome creation. For born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust were things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous. There is no word to describe them.
A whole genre would appear, known now as the big bug movies, with titles like Tarantula, which superimposed a real spider to look 100 feet tall, The Black Scorpion, The Deadly Mantis, Earth versus the Spider, and The Fly. Generally speaking, there was a nice formula to these films that combined the relief of venting a little of that Cold War anxiety with a neat ending to the story. The scientists were often the heroes, along with the government, each insect or arachnid menace defeated by competent authorities like soldiers and the police. Now, dear listeners, I must say something out the gate here. At no point have I ever gotten the shit that I got from the next episode we are taking a section from. Did I offend people? Not exactly. What I did was even more reckless, careless, and according to one listener who said they can't in good conscience continue to listen to the show, deeply irresponsible because, I quote, words mean things. I pronounced this important word in the George Bushian manner I was taught during my childhood. Again and again, I said it. I said nuclear. But since then, I've gone through self-designed rehabilitation for my Bush speak, and now, with no lack of struggle, I can pronounce it correctly. Ready? Nuclear, nuclear, nuclear. Was that right? I'm never really sure. Now, I know that part of growth is admitting to your past mistakes, so here they are on full display in our next excerpt. Now that that's out of the way, I want to share this next part because it shows more of the culture around nuclear fears, how Americans dealt with the possibility of being hit with an atomic bomb, both adults as well as children. Also included is a later section of the episode that deals with some of the apocalyptic predictions that scientists have made about climate change and the future of the planet, the possible future we will be looking at in our upcoming series. So check out this excerpt from our first season finale from 2019, The End of the World.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
When physicist Robert Oppenheimer, one of the inventors of the nuclear bomb, made that famous comment in 1945 after watching the first tests in the deserts of New Mexico, it wasn't the only time he referred to his invention in spiritual terms. Quote, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatements can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. The descriptions by scientists and generals of the blast in New Mexico often compared it to doomsday or to the second coming of Christ, with one general calling attention to, quote, the strong, sustained, awesome roar which warned of doomsday and made us feel that we puny things were blasphemous to dare tamper with the forces here thereto reserved to the Almighty. Only 1 month after that test, United States pilots flew over Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, dropping nuclear bombs on both Japanese cities, with the total deaths being somewhere between 129,000 and 226,000 people, almost all of them being civilians. The unimaginable events of World War II were capped off suddenly by the only use to this day of nuclear weapons, and the world at large was struck for the first time with an image of complete annihilation, a mushroom cloud representing a new kind of horrifying death, a new kind of total power that lived in what Americans imagined was a single red button, not unlike the push-button technology that had recently been introduced into the kitchens and living rooms of middle-class homes.
Dum-dum, beedle-dum-dum, beedle-dum-dum, beedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
The satirical film Dr. Strangelove's second title, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, was a perfect description of the strange and detached way that America dealt with this potential of total annihilation. Dummies were used to test the effects of nuclear fallout in the deserts of New Mexico, in fake suburbs made by the U.S. government, in brand-name family fashions that doubled as advertisements, staring out from the glossy pages of magazines. Bert the Turtle became the lovable mascot for nuclear survival, and children in classrooms all over the nation learned about how to duck and cover. Atomic candies were sold with a mushroom cloud cartoon on the wrapper. Bartenders mixed atomic cocktails, department stores had atomic sales, and the atomic bomb dancers headlined burlesque shows. As word got out that ducking and covering would do absolutely nothing to save a person from a nuclear bomb, hucksters saw an opportunity to sell their new wares to a nervous public. By the early 1960s, the middle class was caught up in what turned into a kind of fashionable capitalist panic, and bomb shelters were one of the hottest-selling items, modeled in the middle of malls, department stores, and trade shows. Home economics classes taught girls how to furnish bomb shelters. The Eisenhower Federal Civil Defense Administration created a campaign called Grandma's Pantry that encouraged every home to have at least a week's worth of supplies of food and water in case of a sudden attack. Grocery stores and malls set up displays for Grandma's Pantry, featuring popular products at the time like Tang, cornflakes, and Campbell's soup. Life magazine even ran a story on a newlywed couple who spent their honeymoon in a steel and concrete bunker 12 feet underground. Fallout can be fun, the article said. In reality, it was only the kids who seemed able to feel the true fear of nuclear war. They were not ignorant to the fact that New York City had spent $150,000 on 2.5 million metal dog tags for children to wear so that their bodies could be identified after a nuclear blast, or that schools in Indiana and Utah had begun tattooing children's blood types under their armpits and on their hips, or that Boy Scouts had begun mapping abandoned mines and caves that could serve as shelter from fallout. Only a handful of scientists and psychologists ventured to explore the effects of nuclear fear on school-aged children who expressed fears like, all the people will die and the world will blow up. Researchers were shocked at the detailed descriptions of fallout that the children were able to predict. One psychologist noticed that they were able to describe, quote, the nightmarish horrors with such vividness, it was as if they had seen footage of Hiroshima. Very little was done to combat these psychological effects, and these children of the baby boom grew up with a new, general sense of dread and apprehension about the future, one that each generation to come has continued to inherit. Some sociologists call this a radical futurelessness, the time in which modern humans no longer trusted that there was any real future at all. In 1990, something called the Hotline of Doom was started by a group called the Society for Secular Armageddonism, and by calling 415-673-DOOM, a message would play for the 10,000 total callers, a message that came at a time of rising awareness of something called global warming. It went a little something like this.
We believe the apocalypse is at hand, and our reasons for this belief are overwhelming. Chemical and biological weapons, nuclear proliferation, deforestation, the greenhouse effect, ozone depletion, acid rain, the poisoning of our air and water. These aren't just conversational topics for cocktail parties. They're grade A, unadulterated harbingers of destruction, and they're all proof that we don't need God to end it for us. The coming end will be a strictly do-it-yourself apocalypse.
The wildfires that have roared through the West Coast the last 2 summers have left our skies as mysterious as New England's dark day in 1780, a blood-red moon burning in the ashy sky as hurricanes and earthquakes and floods have rocked the world at higher and higher rates. As Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un traded flagrant nuclear threats in early 2018, an accidental text was sent to all of Hawaii as part of an emergency broadcasting system that said in all caps, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill," leading to widespread panic for 38 minutes until a follow-up text clarified the mistake. We all carry a traumatic past in the ongoing fear of nuclear war, and quite literally since the 1940s, all of us carry radioactive residue in our bodies from nuclear testing. We also carry in our bodies the potential for 2 different types of human future. One in which we act quickly to deal with climate change, and another in which we don't. The New York Magazine article called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells that came out in 2017 shocked the nation with its descriptions of a very Revelations-esque future, its first section aptly titled Doomsday. He details the future that America and the world at large can logically expect if we don't take serious and widespread action to combat the human elements of climate change. In the book of Revelation, when the angels pour out the sun over the people, it can remind one of the rising temperatures that will create millions, possibly even billions of climate refugees fleeing from the unlivable heat. Prophesized famines could be coming in the form of declining crops as the heat causes a decrease in yield and the population continues to grow, and droughts make previously arid land into desert. Plagues in the form of diseases cryogenically frozen in Arctic ice could be reborn as that ice melts, diseases like smallpox and the bubonic plague that are still alive in Siberian ice. It also warns that for every half degree of warming, societies will see between a 10 and 20% increase in the likelihood of armed conflict. The oceans are turning acidic, soaking up as much of the carbon as we produce, killing all the sea life, the oceans and the rivers running red, the looming fear of stars falling from the sky in the forms of nuclear blasts. The effects will be much worse for developing nations, but America is in no way exempt from what is coming. For fear of being deemed alarmists, of being accused of the same kind of hysteria they might be accused of on this very podcast, David Wallace Wells believes that scientists do not actually communicate their true feelings about the frightening data they have. In an interview about his new book-length version of The Uninhabitable Earth, he says, quote, "It didn't seem plausible to me that there was more risk at scaring people too much than there was at not scaring them enough." David truly believes that our fear, our American hysteria, has the potential to mobilize us into much-needed action. We've seen how, from stranger danger to poison products, to pedophile Satanists, to homosexuality, to drugs, all of these overblown fears have led to quick and sweeping legislation, certainly not usually for the best. On one hand, something called psychic numbing can reduce the appropriate emotional response to serious threats, leading us to fear time and time again all these fake apocalypses. What if instead we panicked, and we panicked hard, about the one that science is proving to be more and more real every day? What if we got hysterical? When Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita after watching his atomic bomb explode, some believe that a better translation from the original Sanskrit would have said, "I am become time, the destroyer of worlds." The quote refers not to a sudden and dramatic end, but to a degrading through the passage of time. It isn't a sudden catastrophe we have to look out for, but the ones that sneak up on us. At the end of the Puritan Day of Doom bestseller is written the rhyme, "You had a season, what was your reason, such precious hours to waste? What could you find, what could you mind, that was of greater haste?" What if we stopped accepting this biblical fate that tells us we have no control, that all we can do is wait for the destruction ahead and hope we are one of the chosen?
More after this. And now, back to the show. Our upcoming series deals with the distant future, but for our purposes, aliens are not a part of it, though I think it seems increasingly possible that they will be. I think for many of us, the recent mysterious disclosures of possible UFOs, or UAPs as they're now being referred to, have shaken our foundations more than a little bit. I'm super scared of aliens, so this is at least true for me. But for many who claim to have the unique experience of being abducted, they say that aliens are actually coming to help us, not to hurt us. For a little context for this upcoming excerpt itself, Bud Hopkins was a true believer in alien abductions and spent his life as an author and hypnotherapist, helping people recover repressed memories of alien abductions. Considered a kook by most, Bud nonetheless worked with hundreds who claimed to have been poked and prodded by emotionless aliens, ones he did not believe were benevolent protectors. But for some abductees, aliens had come to tell them about the distant future, to warn us to change course before we bring about our own destruction, whether through our decimation of the natural world or through a nuclear holocaust. These aliens care about us, and they want to save us. So here are a couple sections from our 2021 episodes, Alien Abductions, Part 1 and Part 2. In the fall of 1989, a mutual colleague would introduce Bud Hopkins to a renowned Harvard psychiatrist and author, winner of a Pulitzer Prize in 1977 for a biography on British officer T.E. Lawrence. John Mack had academic street cred, a lot of it, and when he first heard of what this loony artist was up to, he dismissed him, called him mad. But curiosity, or perhaps something beyond, magnetized John Mack to Bud Hopkins, and after he read through the hundreds of letters from abductees, he was fascinated. That real emotion, those bizarre details, the similarities between the events and the humanoids. Suddenly, the head of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School was a believer. Well, he wouldn't like me saying that. Let's just say that the head of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School became a very strong entertainer of the extraterrestrial fringe. John's mother, Eleanor, had died when he was just an infant. His father had been a strict atheist, a true academic in that sense, a professor of history and English at City University of New York. His stepmother, Ruth, was an economist who would read the Bible to him when he was young, but made clear that she was reading it only as literature, as an important cultural touchstone, with absolutely no mystical elements allowed. In the Mack household, the universe was unfeeling, unenchanted. Academia and science were the only thing remotely close to spiritual tenets, and for most of his life, John was content to be an unbeliever in anything that strayed from what could be proven. Before meeting the eccentric Bud Hopkins, John had worked alongside a famously skeptical colleague and friend, astrophysicist Carl Sagan, who we consider to be an uncelebrated hottie in a turtleneck. Together, they were trying to promote peaceful resolutions between the Soviet Union and the United States in order to disarm the world of such horrific, terrifying nuclear power. In 1986, along with 700 others in various academic fields, they walked side by side across a Nevada test site as an act of civil disobedience. But after John started acting like the wild stories of his patients could be true, after he began asserting that all this had some kind of scientific merit, he and Carl would begin to see things quite differently.
There's no evidence for this. I just say that's not implausible. But to have several visits a day, I think, is straining credulity. I would think that at least for the contact myths, that what's involved psychology and theology, and not so much the physical sciences.
After John's extraterrestrial religious conversion, Carl would become one of his most vocal critics. They still had respect for one another, and he even indulged some of John's wackier ideas, sitting with him wearing a blindfold and headphones, doing intensive deep breathing exercises. But as John, with all his impressive academic credentials, began regression therapy on patients of his own, after he started believing in the wild stories his patients were telling him during hypnotherapy, after he began asserting that these confessions had actual scientific merit, the two academics would begin to see things quite differently. But by 1991, things seemed to unravel further, and a mutual colleague told Carl that he needed to give John a reality check. So he drove out to see his friend. Quote, "I tried to argue that on issues of this importance, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and John would have none of that. He was quite content with anecdotal cases and his judgment that these people must be telling the truth because they are so extremely distraught." John had laid out his premise that the power and intensity to which something is felt can tell us whether or not something is true. Carl felt this idea to be very dangerous, noting that dreams cause extreme emotions, and yet we do not consider those to be material world experiences. Carl knew about false memories. He knew they could be as intense as real-world happenings, that they could elicit the same emotions, that these fantasies could take on lives of their own and actually harm the patients. John, of course, disagreed, and would later say of Alien Abduction, quote, "The phenomenon serves to break out of the box that Carl Sagan would keep us in." Perhaps the most impactful of John Mack's hypnotherapy clients, Peter Faust had worked with John to uncover quite a story, one that hit on all the finest points of the American abduction narrative. Right away, he began remembering, starting with his first abductions back in childhood. The next session, he would remember alien experiments that included a little black chip implanted in his brain. He also remembered having sex with what he believed to be female aliens as well. In fact, he'd eventually remember that he'd had an alien lover for eons. Doctor and client together came to believe that the aliens were making what John called a, quote, new breed or tribe, a hybrid form. He continued, Peter and other men and women like him appear to be playing a vital role, breeding with an alien or hybrid mate to produce offspring that would be able to survive in some sort of post-apocalyptic future. As creepy as all that sounds, in many ways it was a hopeful message to John. It wasn't just cold, calculated breeding. It was about helping the human race survive the environmental and nuclear collapse, that dark future that John had feared and then fought against. Peter eventually concluded that behind all the terror, he felt, quote, connected to something infinitely wiser and more powerful than I could imagine, that the phenomenon had some meaning that was greater than just me and my sperm sample.
They seem to be very, very curious about how human beings relate to one another. They seem to be at the most basic human level. They're most interested, it would seem, in all the things that make us particularly human. They're not interested in our water supply or our atomic weapons or anything like that. They're here to, let's say, absorb what they can of the things that are the most wonderful things about human beings. The fact that we love one another, we have emotions, we have jokes, we make love, we have sex, we care for our babies, we care for our planet. They seem to be in awe of those human resources.
Though Bud's aliens were almost robotic figures that were focused on human experimentation and hybrid breeding, their main interest, the main thing they wanted to find out about this strange race of beings as foreign to them as they are to us, was what it was like to feel. Although John Mack saw it differently, saw the alien beings as ultimately loving and even savioristic, he still agreed with Bud on this point. Quote, "The alien beings seem interested in human woundedness." When you think about it, these aliens are not unlike therapists themselves, who, heroically, I might add, witness our hardest feelings without judging us, without making a moral issue out of what often amounts to our biological and conditioned responses to stimuli. In general, our skeptics have made sense of the majority of abduction stories like this. A victim experiences an episode of sleep paralysis and can remember parts of that waking dream, especially the humanoid figures. Often, there's an element of blankness, of missing time, and then later, these unexplained symptoms of anxiety, apprehension, dread, the feeling that something bad has happened, but you can't quite make sense of it. If you're predisposed to a belief in the paranormal, you might find yourself at an alien convention or digging through alien books at the library. However you do it, you come across a description of alien abduction and its accompanying symptoms. Oftentimes, those books and conferences feature hypnotherapists who then encourage you, accidentally, into constructing detailed false abduction memories. And then, bada bing, bada boom, you are a believer, an experiencer, a chosen one. But chosen for what? Well, I guess that depends on who you ask. At the heart of so much of this story of an alien race, whether malevolent or benevolent, is this other biological human need we have for myth, for a spiritual structure. Carl Sagan put it like this, quote, "Dressed in scientific jargon, their immense powers explained by superficially scientific terminology, the gods and demons of old come down from heaven to haunt us, to offer prophetic visions, and to tantalize us with visions of a more hopeful future, a space-age mystery, religious aborning." With his eyes closed in his own session of hypnotherapy, John Mack once had an epiphany. He had been Harvard's head of psychiatry, a man raised by academic atheists, a man who would later rebel. Quote, "I see why I'm so interested in this abduction story, because it's the opposite of my belief system, because I was raised to believe in a universe with nothing in it. No God, no intelligence, no life, no nothing." Beyond just the desire for our emotions to be witnessed without judgment, I think we still ache for something more than that. We want to be loved unconditionally, to feel safe and cared for in our little place in the universe. John Mack heard most often from his patients that aliens were trying to save humanity from its own destruction, that they were looking at us from on high. They were beings who wanted to help us save the planet and save our souls. And that's going to do it for this installment of Context Clues. Make sure you come back next week for our very weird, far-flung, future-focused series. This was American Hysteria. If our show is important to you, the best way to support us is to become a patron at patreon.com/American Hysteria or to subscribe on Apple Plus. Not only will you get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping the show continue, but you'll also get access to ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, like the other podcast I do with our producer Miranda called Hysteria Home Companion, where we tell you stories related to the topic that were either left out of the episode or that we think that you'll love, because we know you pretty well by now. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. It will seriously help us out. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you can grab some of our merch, and you can leave us a message on our Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up, and we might make an entire episode about it. This episode has sound design and production by Riley Swedelius Smith, and it was edited by Miranda Zickler. And I'm your host, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great week.